Hello everyone and welcome to my channel Y&R Trends. I hope everyone is having a wonderful day. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. The gentle hum of the penthouse living room was a stark contrast to the storm of emotions that had been brewing for weeks. A quiet space that had witnessed whispered conspiracies, tearful confrontations, and the slow, painful unraveling of a family's trust. It was in this deceptively calm setting that Lily Winters found herself standing, her posture rigid, her knuckles white as she clutched the back of an armchair, not for support, but to ground herself against the tidal wave of her own fury. She had just come from a place of profound vulnerability, a moment of intense physical and emotional intimacy with Holden, a desperate attempt to reconnect with the solid, dependable core of a man she felt she was losing to the shadows of his own family. The act itself had been charged, not merely with passion, but with a frantic energy, a last-ditch effort to feel something pure and untainted by the constant, gnawing presence of corporate warfare and familial betrayal. She had looked into Holden's eyes, so full of steadfast love and a frustrating naivete, and had given herself over to the moment, hoping to silence the screaming voice in her head that was always talking about Chancellor Winters, about the merger, about her brother. And in the quiet, breathless aftermath, as they lay tangled in the dim light of his bedroom, a clarity had descended upon her, cold and sharp as a shard of ice. It was in that clarity that the 5 words were formed, not as a spontaneous outburst, but as a calculated, necessary detonation. She had left Holden sleeping, his face peaceful in a way that made her heart ache with a mixture of love and resentment, and had walked back into the main living area, the plush carpet muffling her steps. She needed a glass of water, a moment to collect the shattered pieces of her composure, to rebuild the walls that intimacy had temporarily lowered. But fate, or perhaps the cruel script of Genoa city life, had other plans. The soft click of the penthouse door opening made her freeze, her back still turned. She didn't need to see him to know who it was. The very air in the room shifted, growing heavier, charged with a history of competition and a recent searing betrayal. Kane's presence was always announced by a subtle combination of cologne and unspoken tension. She heard him take a few steps into the room, his own movements hesitant, as if he was an intruder in a space that had once felt as much his as anyone's, a space where they had all shared laughter and family meals that now felt like artifacts from a forgotten, simpler time. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence was a battleground, each second stretching out, laden with the weight of everything that had gone unsaid. Lily finally turned, her eyes meeting his, and in that single glance, a universe of shared history and present animosity flashed between them. He looked tired, Kane did, the charming bravado he usually wore like a second skin seeming frayed at the edges. There was a question in his eyes, a typical Kane expression that was part apology and part defiance, a look that had once charmed her but now only served to fuel her anger. He was about to speak, likely to launch into another one of his justifications, another explanation of how his actions, his secret alliance with Jill, his undermining of her authority, were all for the good of the company, for the family. But Lily cut him off before a single syllable could leave his lips. Her voice, when it came, was not the fiery shout he might have expected. It was low, measured, and carried a chill that seemed to drop the temperature in the room by several degrees. It was the voice of a CEO, a Winters, a woman who had been pushed to her absolute limit. "I just had sex with Holden." The statement hung in the air, stark and brutal in its simplicity. It was not an invitation for gossip or a shared confidence between old friends. It was a declaration, a line drawn in the sand. Kane's eyebrows raised slightly, a flicker of surprise and perhaps discomfort crossing his features. This was personal. This was a territory he had no right to enter, a part of Lily's life that was supposed to be separate from their boardroom battles. He shifted his weight, unsure of where this was going, already formulating a defensive, or perhaps sarcastic, retort about not needing the details of her marital life. But Lily was not finished. She took a single step forward, her gaze unwavering, pinning him to the spot. And then she delivered the 5 words, the 5 words that were not about the act itself, but about its catalyst, its profound and painful motivation. She looked directly at him, her eyes boring into his, and said, "Because of what you did." The impact was not immediate. It was a slow-acting poison. For a second, Kane's face was a blank canvas of confusion, the words not yet computing in their full, devastating context. Then, like a delayed reaction to a physical blow, the meaning slammed into him. His posture, usually so confident and slightly arrogant, seemed to deflate. The air left his lungs in a soft, almost imperceptible sigh. His eyes, which had been holding hers with a stubborn challenge, now dropped, skittering away to focus on a meaningless point on the wall behind her. Because of what you did. It wasn't an accusation of causing a simple argument. It wasn't a complaint about a business decision. It was a statement that linked his betrayal in the corporate world to the most intimate, private corner of her life. He had driven her to this. He had created such a chasm of stress, such a profound sense of isolation and fury, that her only perceived path to solace, to reconnecting with something solid and good, was through a physical act with her husband. He had, in effect, orchestrated the moment of intimacy between Lily and Holden, not as a cherished expression of love, but as a desperate antidote to the toxicity he had introduced into their lives. The regret did not arrive as a single sharp pang, but as a creeping cold dread that started in the pit of his stomach and spread outwards, numbing his fingers and tightening his chest. This was a consequence he had never, in his most calculating moments, anticipated. He had prepared for her anger. He had braced for legal battles, for cold shoulders at family dinners, for shouting matches in the office. He was equipped for war on the battlefield of business and family drama. But this was different. This was a violation of a sacred boundary he hadn't even known he was crossing. He had been so focused on winning, on securing power, on proving his worth and securing his place, that he had completely divorced his actions from their human emotional fallout. He saw now with horrifying clarity that the rift he had created wasn't just about stock percentages and board votes. It had seeped into the very bedrock of Lily's marriage, into her bedroom, into the space between her and Holden. He had forced her to use her own husband as a refuge from him. His mind, always so quick with a retort or a manipulation, was suddenly terrifyingly empty. What could he possibly say? "I'm sorry" was laughably inadequate, a pebble thrown into a canyon. Any justification about protecting the company from her merger plans, about his mother's influence, about his own birthright, crumbled to dust in the face of this revelation. Those were arguments of the boardroom, of ego and strategy. This was about the soul. He saw the raw pain in Lily's eyes, a pain that was now inextricably linked to his own choices, and he understood that he had lost something far more valuable than a corporate title or a seat at the table. He had forfeited a piece of her trust that could never be fully reclaimed. The image of Lily and Holden together, an image that under any other circumstance would have been a neutral fact of life, was now forever tainted by his own actions. He was the ghost in that room, the unwelcome third party whose shadow had fallen across the marriage bed. He finally managed to look back at her, and the defiance was gone, replaced by a hollowed-out shame. He saw not just the anger of a business partner betrayed, but the deep personal hurt of a woman who had been pushed to the brink by someone she had once considered family, someone she had trusted, someone she had, in a different life, loved. The victory he had felt after his boardroom maneuver with Jill now tasted like ash in his mouth. It was a Pyrrhic victory of the most profound order. He had won a battle for control, but in doing so he had demonstrated a fundamental lack of character that had reverberated into the most private corners of another person's life. The silence stretched on, now thick and suffocating. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. What was there to say? The 5 words echoed in the space between them, a verdict that required no judge or jury. Because of what you did. They were not just words, they were a life sentence of regret, and as he stood there, utterly defeated by the truth he could not escape, Kane knew, with a certainty that chilled him to his core, that he would carry the weight of this moment, and the intimate consequence of his actions, for the rest of his days. The night had fallen over Genoa City like a heavy velvet curtain, and the mansion felt emptier than ever, even with the faint hum of the chandelier overhead. Lily moved through the hallway quietly, her heart pounding in a rhythm she barely recognized. She wasn't supposed to be here, she knew that, but something in her mind kept drawing her toward Holden's study. She told herself it was just a moment, just a fleeting need to be understood, to feel something other than the weight of Kane's expectations pressing down on her. Every step closer to that closed door made her stomach twist with a combination of guilt and anticipation. When she finally stood in front of the mahogany door, her hand hesitated on the knob, trembling as if it carried the consequences of the world. Inside, Holden looked up from the papers he'd been pretending to review. The intensity in his eyes was always there, like a spark waiting for kindling, and tonight it was dangerous. He didn't ask why she was there. The question seemed unnecessary. Instead, he closed the folder, leaned back in his chair, and let the silence hang heavy between them. Lily swallowed, her lips dry, and realized that the attraction she'd tried so hard to suppress all these months was finally too much to ignore. She told herself it wasn't about love, not really, but the ache inside her demanded to be recognized, even if only for a moment. Lily. Holden's voice was low, almost a whisper, yet it carried a weight that made her shiver. She stepped inside, closing the door behind her, and felt the chill of the room mix with the warmth radiating from him. "Are you sure about this?" he asked, but his words weren't really a warning. They were an acknowledgement of the tension they'd both been dancing around. She didn't answer, because any words now would betray the storm of emotions she couldn't control. Instead, she moved closer, each step deliberate, each glance loaded with everything neither of them could say out loud. Time seemed to slow, the world outside the study fading into nothingness. Lily felt Holden's hand brush against hers in a fleeting, almost accidental touch, and it sent a jolt of electricity up her arm. She knew this was dangerous. She knew Kane would never forgive her. Yet at the same time, the longing, the desire to be seen for who she was underneath the carefully constructed life, made it impossible to step back. There was no turning around. Whatever happened next would be irreversible. A line crossed that could never be uncrossed, and Lily's heart raced with both fear and forbidden excitement. And then Kane's voice broke through the quiet like a knife. "Lily." It was the single word that shattered the fragile bubble around her, making her stomach drop. She hadn't expected him to be home this early, and now the consequences of her choices loomed larger than ever. Holden's hand went instinctively to her shoulder, a silent gesture of reassurance, while she stepped back, suddenly feeling exposed, vulnerable in ways she hadn't prepared for. Kane's footsteps grew louder, deliberate, each one a drumbeat of impending doom. Lily's mind raced. She needed to say something, anything that would hold him at bay, that would somehow explain the chaos in her heart. But what could she possibly say that wouldn't betray everything? And then, without thinking, without any filter, the words tumbled from her lips, sharp and devastating. "I can't stop loving Holden." Kane froze, the world narrowing down to the sound of her voice, each word striking him with a force he hadn't thought possible. His hands clenched, jaw tightening, eyes glistening with the realization of what he had feared but refused to confront. Those 5 words, the ones that should have never been spoken, hung in the air like smoke from a fire he couldn't put out. Every plan, every vow, every moment he had believed in was now fractured. Kane's mind spun, and for the first time in years he felt powerless, watching the woman he loved drift emotionally into someone else's orbit, unable to do anything but watch. Kane stood frozen in the doorway, every fiber of his being screaming with disbelief. His chest tightened, and he felt a hollow ache spread through him as if the world itself had shifted beneath his feet. "You what?" His voice cracked, the words barely a whisper, carrying the weight of betrayal and heartbreak. The room seemed impossibly still, every tick of the clock hammering home the reality of what he had just heard. Lily's eyes met his, wide and panicked, and for the first time, she saw the depth of his devastation mirrored in her own reflection. She had expected anger, maybe hurt, but not this raw, soul-crushing sorrow that left both of them gasping in silence. Holden, ever the observer of human weakness, took a step back. He knew the power of words, the way they could cut sharper than any weapon. He let Kane process the revelation, letting the tension stretch unbearably long. "Kane," Lily began, her voice trembling, "I didn't mean for this to happen." But Kane didn't hear her. He couldn't. All he could see was the image of her standing there, vulnerable yet undeniably drawn to Holden, and a torrent of emotions surged inside him. Shock, anger, grief, and an ache he had never known could exist so deeply. He clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms as if the pain could somehow be grounded in flesh. How long?" he finally choked out, his voice raw, eyes glistening with unshed tears. Lily swallowed hard, her own tears threatening to spill. She wanted to explain, to justify, to undo the moment with words, but she knew there were no words that could reverse the damage. I don't know, she whispered, the honesty in her voice barely audible. Every syllable felt like it was ripping through her chest. She hated the hurt she had caused, but the undeniable pull toward Holden had been impossible to resist. It just happened, she added, voice shaking, and I can't take it back. Kane's shoulders slumped, and for the first time, he looked smaller, less like the unshakable man everyone in Genoa City believed him to be. His heart, which had always carried the steady rhythm of love and protection for Lily, now pounded with confusion and betrayal. Holden watched, careful not to interfere, aware that any gesture could ignite a storm beyond control. And yet, he didn't step back entirely, not because he wanted to escalate, but because he too understood the magnitude of the connection that had always simmered quietly between him and Lily. You're choosing him over me? Kane's voice cracked again, disbelief morphing into bitter anger. He paced a few steps, unable to stand still, and the mansion that had always felt like a sanctuary now seemed suffocating. Every corner seemed to mock him, a reminder of vows and promises made and now potentially shattered. Lily's lips quivered as she tried to reach out, to soothe, but Kane recoiled, not wanting the comfort she offered. Every instinct screamed to protect what he loved most. Yet in that instant, he realized he might have already lost it. Holden cleared his throat softly, a subtle reminder that he was present, that he hadn't left Lily alone in the aftermath of her confession. Kane, I didn't, he began, but Kane spun toward him, fury blazing in his eyes. Don't. Just don't, Kane snapped. I can't know. I can't believe this. His words were jagged, fragments of a man unraveling before their very eyes. Lily sank onto the edge of Holden's desk, feeling the weight of her actions press down like a tidal wave she could not escape. For a moment silence reigned. It was thick, suffocating, and every heart in that room beat erratically. Kane's hands shook slightly at his sides, as if the physical motion could expel the pain he felt inside. He had always believed in loyalty, in the bonds that had tied him to Lily for years. But in that instant those beliefs seemed fragile, almost meaningless, overshadowed by a single devastating truth. She had said the words that no husband ever wants to hear from the woman he loves. Lily tried to stand, to approach him, but Kane held up a hand, his face a mixture of heartbreak and incredulity. Don't. Just stay there. His voice was low, controlled yet trembling, each word a dagger. I need to think. I need to understand how you could say that to me. The room felt unbearably small, every glance heavy with regret, every heartbeat a reminder of the choices that had been made. Holden, sensing the depth of the wound, finally spoke, his voice calm but firm. Kane, I care about her too, but this isn't about me. It's about what she's feeling, what she's been holding inside. Kane's eyes blazed, narrowing at the man who had become the catalyst of his heartbreak. You don't get to justify this, Kane said through clenched teeth, voice shaking with a mixture of rage and sorrow. You don't get to stand there and explain why my wife, why Lily, why she. He trailed off, the final word hanging like smoke in the room, and then turned sharply, retreating toward the hallway. Lily's heart sank as she watched him leave, the weight of her confession pressing down like 1,000 stones. She knew that those 5 words, I can't stop loving Holden, would haunt him, haunt her, and forever change the fragile equilibrium of their marriage. She had wanted a moment of understanding, a fleeting connection, but instead, she had opened a door she could never close. And as Holden reached for her hand, she pulled it away, not ready to face the consequences of what had just unfolded. The mansion was silent once more, the echoes of Kane's heartbreak lingering in every room. Lily sank into the chair behind Holden's desk, burying her face in her hands, tears spilling over, realizing with gut-wrenching clarity that her life had changed irrevocably. Holden sat beside her, careful, steady, offering comfort without crossing the fragile line that still existed. And somewhere in the house, Kane walked alone, grappling with a pain that words could barely capture, knowing that the regret he felt now would follow him long after the night ended.